King of the Harem Heaven, Chapter 13. On a spring day in 1919, a commotion broke out at the House of David amusement park. As the tourists and pleasure seekers crowded about to watch, the kindly little old lady who tended the curio stand suddenly began shouting at a pretty teenage girl, grabbing both her shoulders and shaking her again and again. This was Mrs. Isabel Pritchard, the Australian widow to whose daughters King Ben had promised to be a father. "You're lying!" the gray-haired woman shrieked. "You know you're lying!" "It's true, Mama," the young girl cried. "That's what he did. To Irene, too?" Choking and sobbing, Hilda Pritchard nodded. Her face dark with anger, Mrs. Pritchard snatched up one of the small cheap Bibles sold at her concession. "Here! Put your hand on this! Now you swear to me. You swear with God for a witness that you're telling me the truth." "I swear it, Mama." The girl was hysterical now. "That's what happened." For a moment, the little old lady seemed about to collapse. She set the Bible back on the counter and shook her head slowly, breathing very hard. "Then it's true," she gasped softly. "I know how I raised you. You wouldn't lie on the book. It must be true." She hesitated for a long time, then suddenly straightened up, her face dark with rage again. "Come on!" Grabbing Hilda by the wrist, she dragged her out from behind the stand and bowled her way directly through the growing crowd with her head lowered, shouldering and elbowing the curious onlookers aside. As she went out through the gates of the park and directly across the street toward the business offices of Shiloh, the outsiders swarmed after her to see the fun. Inside the office, Esther Johnson and Edith Meldrum tried to stop her, but she forced her way into each of the rooms and then started upstairs, the teenage girl still in tow behind her. "Where's Ben?" she shouted at everyone. "I want to see Ben right now." The king wasn't in Shiloh, not in his quarters or any of the adjacent rooms. Keeping her hand locked tightly about her daughter's wrist, Isabel Pritchard slammed back downstairs and out of the building. The crowd along as she hurried past the arch to search Jerusalem, once again forcing her way into every room. "Where's that old fraud hiding?" she demanded of Queen Mary and Cora Mooney, as they stared at her, shocked and indignant. "He might as well come out. I'll find him." Finally, she headed down the street and over the beautifully landscaped grounds of the magnificent new Diamond House, now in the last stages of completion. Still hoping to see the fun, the crowd swarmed after her, trampling down the new evergreens and shrubs and flower beds. Two pillars tried to stop the enraged woman at the door. Without relaxing her grip on her daughter, she smashed one in the stomach with her elbow, leaving him doubled up and choking for breath. She locked her fingers in the beard of the other, yanked him forward to trip and fall across the first, then went on in with the crowd cheering her on. She caught Ben Purnell just inside the big entrance hall, coming out to see what all the noise was about. "You sneaking old goat," she shrieked at him. "You're as phony as your dyed hair." "Keep your voice down," he urged her, noticing the audience on the porch. "Keep my voice down? I came halfway around the world to find the true faith. You took all my money. You ruined my girls. Now you tell me to keep my voice down?" "Don't make a scene here," he ordered her. "I'll make a scene all right, you old fraud. The son of man, are you? Well, I'd son of man you son of a..." With a loud explosive crack, she hauled off and slammed him across the face. He caught her arm just as she was about to swing again. She let go of Hilda's wrist and brought the other hand up to claw at his eyes like a wildcat. His patience exhausted, King Ben had just drawn back his arm and doubled up his fist to strike her when he realized that the crowd was surging through the door and moving in on him menacingly. He turned and pulled free with the scratching, hair and beard-pulling woman chasing after him. Hitting an alarm button, he raced up the stairs to take refuge in a second-floor room, latching the door behind him. A well-drilled force of long-haired young men appeared almost instantly, armed with leaded clubs, politely but firmly suggesting that the trespassers return to the amusement park. The Pritchard widow was also reminded that she had no business here, reminded by a frozen-faced pillar who had her escorted from Diamond House by a pair of husky Israelites who locked her arms tightly and ignored her violent threats. "I'm not through with the old goat yet," she promised them. "Not by a long shot." She hurried to find Irene, who was working as the king's personal cook. She rushed both girls out of the colony. Then she went into circuit court with a morals complaint, charging the bearded prophet with raping her daughters. There had been too many such complainants for this charge to be passed off lightly. Mrs. Lulu Boschke, the Fortney girls, Mose Clark, and yet, while Ben Purnell took another quick Canadian vacation, his lieutenants prepared a defense that was extremely effective. His attorney introduced into evidence several hundred signed statements, one from every Israelite female above the age of puberty, each testifying to the king's absolute purity of conduct. The Pritchard charges were smothered by the sheer weight of numbers. The Seventh Kingdom had weathered still another storm. But even so, these were the twilight years for the God King. For the following year, he made the serious mistake of turning Esther Johnson against him. No one had served the bearded prophet more faithfully than this trim-figured little Swedish woman, now 30 years of age. She'd tricked and bribed and blackmailed his accusers. She'd silenced rebellion within his domain by a wide variety of underhanded intrigues. He'd reserved only the most delicate assignments for her, and she never failed him. Ben's attorneys later claimed that his quarrel with his girl Friday began when he refused her $1,000 she wanted to take a business course at a nearby college. Esther herself insisted that the quarrel grew out of her friendship for an Israelite family who'd become disillusioned and were preparing to leave the colony, a family whose son she later married. Chances are that still another factor was involved. King Ben had the foolish habit of letting his current harem favorite indulge her every whim. Most likely some 15 or 16-year-old, jealous and resentful of Esther Johnson's power and authority in the cult, poisoned the prophet's mind against her. Whatever the original cause or the argument, a morning came when Esther found herself locked out of her own private office. "I want to see Benjamin," she told his new executive secretary, H.T. Dewhurst, firmly. "I think he knows better than this." Dewhurst shook his head coldly. He was a newcomer to the sect, a former circuit court judge from Redlands, California, a former Methodist Sunday school teacher, a former head of the local YMCA. Upon being converted and arriving at the House of David, his first work assignment had been picking up waste paper on the amusement park grounds. But his rise to power had been almost as rapid as Esther Johnson's fall from power. King Benjamin's health had been failing rapidly. An old fall from a horse had been troubling him lately. In addition, the doctors he'd been secretly consulting had found him suffering seriously from tuberculosis. More and more, he'd been delegating the work of running his kingdom. More and more, he'd come to depend upon Judge Dewhurst. "Benjamin is unable to see anyone today," the judge told her. "Benjamin isn't feeling too well." "He'll feel a lot worse before I'm done with him," Esther promised. She returned to her room and found Cora Mooney waiting for her there. "Benjamin has decided he wants this wing remodeled," the high priestess of Shiloh, who'd been with the prophet since Fostoria, announced. "He wishes you to move out to the big farm for a while." "I see," Esther said softly. The only living quarters at the farm were tar paper shacks. This was banishment. "The truth of the matter is you're no longer welcome here," Cora Mooney said haughtily. "You may as well realize it." Esther turned and stared at her a moment. "I don't like the tone of your voice," she decided. "What you like or don't like isn't quite as important around here as it once was." "Isn't it?" Esther Johnson smiled dangerously. "Do you have any idea just how much I know about this place and everyone in it? You're not talking to little Eliza Murphy now." Who's Eliza Murphy?" The high priestess's voice was faltering and unconvincing. "Come now." Esther's laugh was crisp and deadly. "I know all the details and I can prove them. I even know where she's buried." "Now what were you saying to me?" "It's not my fault," Cora Mooney whined. "I'm just obeying Benjamin's commandments." "Well, you go right on obeying them if you like, but you be a little more careful about how you talk to me. Is that clear?" The high priestess merely nodded in silence. "All right, now get out of here. I want to pack." Esther Johnson had seen this moment coming on for months, and she'd secreted a number of important papers to take with her. She moved to Grand Rapids, divorced the husband given to her in the 1910 group marriages, and married the son of the apostate Israelite family she'd befriended. Preparing detailed and documented evidence, she encouraged her father-in-law to sue for every cent he'd originally turned into the House of David, plus interest and wages for the time he'd worked in the colony. In 1923, a judgment of $24,000 was returned. For the very first time in his two-decade reign, a case against King Ben had held up in court. That same year, two young sisters named Ruth and Gladys Bamford swore out rape charges against the long-haired prophet and sued him for $200,000. With Ruth Bamford, Ben Purnell's harem had completed the full cycle of a generation. She'd been born in a colony, less than a month after her mother had entered in 1907. The story of the Bamford girls told from the witness stand had a familiar ring. Their father had died of pneumonia in a poorly heated shack, and King Ben had promised he'd be a father to them. Their mother now appeared as a defense witness to profess her faith in the prophet and to swear her daughters were lying. In both the 1923 trials, Hazel Ruth Wade offered her services as a plaintiff's witness. In neither of these civil suits did Ben Purnell actually show up to defend himself. As a matter of fact, it was suddenly realized that no outsider had seen King Ben since October of 1922. The weight of public opinion had finally become too great to be ignored. Editorial writers throughout the entire state were screaming for the bearded monarch's scalp. The Detroit Free Press led the attack, running one front-page expose after another, and newspapers the nation over began carrying the stories. Demands for actions poured onto the governor's desk and rang out in the legislative chambers. A grand jury was hastily convened and a standing warrant for his arrest was issued. But when a surprise raid was made on the house of David, there was no sign of King Ben. Judge Dewhurst and the other pillars blandly told reporters he'd gone up to heaven in a flaming chariot like Elijah. The state of Michigan answered this by putting a $3,000 price on his head. Tips were checked out by the thousands. Raid after raid was made on the colony. Israelite life went on as usual. The amusement park ran full blast. The baseball team thrilled local crowds and toured the country. The factories and farms kept on producing. But the long-haired bearded king was nowhere to be found. Then reports came drifting in from out of the country. Someone had seen him in Canada. He was in London. He was found in a new kingdom in New Zealand, Australia, Tokyo, Paris, Berlin. For nearly 4 full years, the police of the entire world hunted King Ben in vain. Then a new rumor came out of nowhere and began spreading rapidly. "He's dead," citizens of Benton Harbor would laughingly tell reporters. "Of course he's dead. He's been dead for years. But only Queen Mary and Dewhurst and a few others even know about it. They're keeping it from the rest because King Ben's supposed to be immortal, and they're all supposed to attain immortality if they believe in him. If they knew he was dead, the colony would go to pieces overnight." The rumor made sense. In the time between his last public appearance and the issuing of the standing warrant for his arrest, every reporter who had attempted to interview him had been politely escorted about the colony by Judge Dewhurst. References to the king had been commonly heard. He wasn't feeling well this morning. He just left to drive out to the big farm. He couldn't see anyone today, but maybe tomorrow. Telephone calls, supposedly to the king, were invariably made in front of newsmen, but no one had actually seen him. The rumor not only made sense, it made a beautiful human interest story. A colorful religious sect held together only by a belief in the immortality of a man who was actually long dead. More and more newspapers began dignifying the rumor in print. Bit by bit, the long fruitless hunt for the king slowed to a halt. The authorities also began accepting the theory that he'd been dead for years. Suddenly, in mid-November of 1926, the Detroit Free Press received what was first regarded as a crank letter. A girl named Bessie Daniels, claiming to be a former Inner Circle member who just recently left the colony, told the fantastic story that King Ben was very much alive, that he'd never left the house of David, much less the country, that he'd been hiding in the colony itself for more than 4 years. The letter was checked out by state troopers as a matter of routine, just as the thousands of earlier tips had been checked. "How could he hide there this long?" the officers demanded. "He's in Diamond House," Bessie Daniels told them. "He had it built with secret rooms and passageways and hidden doorways, and he's got an electric warning system." "Who knows he's there?" "At least half the people in the colony." "We've had that place watched day after day for years. You say he had a bunch of young girls sent to him every night? Our men would have noticed anything like that." "Sometimes they dressed up like old women and had us hunch over when we walked, and we went in one at a time. Sometimes we took mops and brooms and buckets and pretended we were a cleaning crew." "Old King Ben would be somewhere in his mid-60s if he's still alive. Are you actually trying to tell us that little more than a year ago he still wanted whole bunches of girls sent over every night?" Bessie Daniels blushed. "I can't help how old he was. He still wanted us sent over all right." "Young lady, do you realize how many times that place was raided and searched? Sure, and I think he was tipped off every time. I saw Queen Mary talking with the sheriff after one of those raids, and I heard her say, "There's 1,000 votes right here. We can swing any way we like, and don't you forget it." The amazed officer looked at the other troopers and scratched his head. "I'll be darned if I don't believe her." He rose to his feet, and his voice was crisp and efficient. "All right, we're going out there right now, and there will be no tip-off this time." Just a little before midnight, several carloads of police screeched to a stop in front of Diamond House. The heavily bolted doors were smashed in with axes. In the dimly lit interior, a woman was seen running upstairs. The troopers quickly overtook her, then followed the Daniels girl's directions through an invisible door in the wall and along a hidden passageway cleverly built into the shell of the mansion. Deep in a secret system of rooms, the 65-year-old king was trapped in bed. With him in her nightgown was Myrtle Tulk, who claimed to be his nurse. Also with him and similarly dressed, with no such explanation for their presence, were 2 teenage girls. Blinking and cursing as cameras flashed in his face, snarling like an old bear brought to bay, Benjamin Franklin Purnell was hauled off to jail. The long hunt was over.